Armistice Day, 1940. The day started out beautiful. It's just like any other ordinary fall day. Minnesota was primarily agricultural, and things seemed fairly normal. A day to remember. But in those days, 1940, there was no advanced national weather service like we have today, where they can predict the weather days in advance. There weren't cell phones. In fact, many homes didn't even have telephones at all. The day started out mild, sunny, people dressed accordingly with just light clothing on. But by mid-afternoon, it had turned horribly cold. The wind picked up from the north. It was very, very cold. It started to snow, and people were not dressed properly. Many duck hunters were out in their blinds and weren't dressed properly and died, froze to death. Farmers had a very difficult time getting to their animals out in the barn. Some of them got lost, blinded by the snow, and froze to death in the groves close to their farms.
It's a story that my mother told many times over the years of what happened with her during the Armistice Day Blizzard, November 11th, 1940.
As I look back to my years at the Lakeville High School, there was one occasion I will never forget. On November 11th, 1940, my brother Julian and I rode the school bus to Lakeville as usual.
It was a mild day in November and warm. It was kind of overcast, a little bit misty. And her and her brother Julian rode the school bus to school each day. So they just dressed in light clothes. They wore light jackets, no hats or scarves, no gloves, mittens. And the girls all wore skirts to school, so she wore a skirt that day.
Before noon, it had started to snow heavily. We were served our lunch and then dismissed.
They called for the school bus, and the owner and operator of the school bus was Arnold Sauber.
My dad had a transportation company before he and my mother got married in '41, and part of that transportation was starting the bus service. He also delivered cream to Lakeville and milk to Farmington. So the bus service was part of him driving and working with vehicles.
And so he came to pick up the kids at school after they had fed them lunch, and they started out for Credit River Township, is where my mom grew up on a farm. And so they only got maybe 2 miles out of Lakeville, traveling west.
A terrible blizzard hit the area. It was impossible to see the road, and finally the bus became stuck in a huge drift.
Arnold tried in vain to get the bus out of the snowdrift, get the bus unstuck, and it just wasn't working. And eventually the transmission went out on the bus, and so they were stranded there. Arnold made some attempts to locate some shelter for them, but the visibility was really very bad. They couldn't see. So they just kind of tried to wait it out. And when it got to be about 7 o'clock at night, Arnold felt that if they stayed in the bus, they would freeze to death. It was very cold out, very windy, and the bus was running out of gasoline. Arnold made a decision based on a farm that he had passed about a half a mile or quarter mile back, that they should all hold hands, form a chain, don't let go, and we're going to make it to this farm. Arnold and some boys led the way because they had long pants on, and then the girls were next, and they tried to walk in the tracks of the boys. The oldest boys brought up the rear to make sure no kids were left behind. And they walked about a quarter of a mile to a farm. And they got to the farm, and they got inside, and they were in shelter. There was frostbite in their ears, etc. And my mom described having to literally peel ice off the back of her calves. The farm family was a young couple that had one baby.
We thought the farmer's wife must have gone into shock with 26 kids coming into her home. We were never offered any food that evening or breakfast the next morning. After closing the kitchen door, she made breakfast for her own family and then asked us if we would like a cup of coffee.
They didn't have a telephone, so there was no calling for help. Arnold decided that that wasn't a good place to just camp out for the remainder of the storm, so he and two of the oldest boys, one of them being my mother's brother, decided to walk for help. And Arnold's family farm was about 2 miles away. So they walked through the snowdrifts 2 miles to the Sauber farm. They got a team of workhorses and a box sled. He brought the sled to the other farm. They loaded all the kids into the back of the sled and covered them all over with horse blankets. And they made their way into the town of Lakeville. And the first place they stopped was the local cafe. And Arnold told all the kids, go in, order whatever you want to eat. Don't worry about paying for it, it'll be fine. And in the meantime, he got a hold of the superintendent of Lakeville Schools, and they started calling families in Lakeville and asking if they could take a child or two in until they could get back home. My mother and another girl stayed with one family, and her brother and another guy stayed with a different family. And her brother and his friend decided they could shovel snow and make some money. And the local movie theater operator opened up the movie theater for the kids. One of the evenings, they could go and they could have popcorn and they could watch the movies.
After a terrible experience in the blizzard, it was so great to be safe and sound and to be treated with such kindness.
And the people in town had telephones. My grandparents, my mother's parents, didn't know where they were, and for over 24 hours. Once they got into town, they could call the families and say, your children are safe. It was 3 days before my grandfather could get into town to bring them back home. Arnold, he was only 25 years old when he had the responsibility for all these kids and making sure that they didn't perish, that they got brought to safety.
We never really heard about the blizzard story. This was all news to me, and wonderfully so, when I talked with Judy and she filled me in on her mother's write-up. And he had the bus company until he was drafted for the war. So it does not surprise me at all that my dad would have done the very best he could for the kids.
He not only brought them to safety once, he brought them to safety 2 times by walking to his parents' farm and getting the horses and the sled and making sure they were all covered up and warm. And so he took a lot of responsibility for a young man of 25.